Okay, so I was being totally lazy by having those first two videos from POL 1001 and using them here. It's the same basic thing. I get that it wasn't exactly tailored for you guys, but come on. I'm so lazy that what can I do? So let's ignore that. Let's talk about one more thing, just because you guys have a little more going for you here than the 101 class does. Um, and you can think more about these things, and I think it's a really important thing to consider. And that's, how are these human rights enforced? Remember going back to global governance when we were talking about that, and just the idea of collective action problems. Sometimes the enforcement is not by the government. So when we're talking about human rights, there's no, I mean, if we're talking about the international level, there's no government to do the enforcement. Remember anarchy and all that. So one of the things is, what's the role of the international community, and especially the UN, which we've delegated a lot of this responsibility to the UN to take care of this. So one thing is, there's this thing called the UN Commission on Human Rights. There's a couple problems with this. Number one is, this committee or this commission, who's on this commission is going to be states. Which states? Well, not a lot of states that are actually human rights supporters. Like, you're on this commission to make sure the commission never comes after you in some cases. So, I mean, Iran's been in charge of this. Libya's been in charge of this commission. I mean, it's just not exactly the most human rightsy commission. So it feels a little broken in that sense. But here's the deal. This is the thing about the UN. The UN plays a role in protecting human rights, enforcing human rights, setting human rights. But most of that role is being played by states. And there's a good reason why. The UN represents states. It doesn't represent humanity. It doesn't represent individual humans, which is what human rights are all about. We didn't talk about this in the last video, but all human rights claims are what we call subversive. So let me talk about this for a second. Remember that a human rights claim is a claim of last resort. In other words, something, let's say it's the state, the government is violating my human rights. And so I can't go to the state, so I have to go around the state and go to humanity, go to the UN, go to whatever and say, my human rights are being violated. So every time somebody says my human rights are being violated, it means either the state is doing it and won't do something about it, or the state hasn't done something about it. And so it's essentially, when I say my human rights are being violated, I'm essentially saying the state is screwing up. It's subversive in that sense. It's saying the state is not doing its job. Now, if we go to the United Nations, we got a problem, because what the United Nations represents is states. It is like essentially a lawyer for states. It's not a lawyer for humanity. It's not a lawyer for individual humans. It would like to see states, protect humanity, individual humans, but it doesn't represent humanity, individual humans. So when it comes down to it, if my human rights are going to be protected, it's going to be by states, not by the United Nations. So either my state or other states coming to sort of enforce my human rights against my own state. So for example, we talked about this before, responsibility to protect, right? The state isn't protecting human rights, and so it gives up the sovereignty so other states can step in. So this is messy. But one of the things we want to talk about here is, even though this is human rights, individual rights, that kind of stuff, it still requires the state system, at least as it is today. So what we want to do is we want to talk about, what do the theories talk about it? Yes, we're back to the theories again. So let's start with realism and liberalism. They're both going to say a universal human right are these things. It is, a universal human right is created by states. States came together and said, this is a human right. If the states, and they did this in the UDHR, if the states didn't agree to it, it's not technically a human right. Even if you think that it is, even if someday later on states will say it's a human right, today it's technically not a human right. It needs the force of sovereign states. If sovereign states aren't going to protect or enforce this, then it doesn't really matter whatever you call it. And then it is promoted or not promoted by, again, sovereign states. And that's going to be realism and realism and liberalism, both saying that the states are incredibly important to how human rights exist, are protected today. Now they're going to split at this point, because realism is going to argue. Now, what would you think realism would say about human rights? When I say realism, you say, good, power. I'm glad I hope you shouted out power in your house and everybody turned to you and said, what's going on? So a human right is not really a right. It is, a nice thing to have, but it's not really a right. It is a tool for states to further their power. So we might ask, from a realist point of view, why does the United States support human rights? And a realist might answer, because human rights give them leverage into other states. Again, it's a tool for power. It's a way to sort of flex power around the world. Now, again, I want to be clear about this. It doesn't mean realists don't think human rights are important or essential. It just means at the international level, they're not really rights. They're things that we would love to have. They're aspirational again, but they're not exactly like legal things you can claim against a state. Any more than in the zombie apocalypse, you can say, hey, you're violating my right. And the person who's violating the right says, I don't understand. What is a right? I don't get what that is. I do what I want when I want. Who's going to stop me? All right, so that's realism. Liberalism, again, I want to be clear. Realism doesn't say human rights don't exist. It just says they're not really rights. Liberalism says a human right is really a right. Again, no big surprise there. This is a very liberal theory. International institutions like the UN can assist states in enforcement of those rights. And again, if we do our nice liberalism line here, liberalism is going to say human rights are the same. They've always been, human rights here and human rights here have always been the same. It's just that here they haven't been practiced as well as they're being practiced here. So as time goes on, we're better and better and better at practicing human rights. Progress, it leads to greater and greater freedom. Human rights will grow stronger and stronger over time. And they would say, let's look back to 1945 when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights first gets written down, and how we talk about human rights today, and how we'll talk about human rights 30 years from now. That's going to be the liberal argument here. All right, so they have very different, they definitely agree on the role of states, but they have very different ideas about what they are and what then states' responsibilities are. What would constructivism say about human rights? When I say constructivism, you say norms, yes. Yell that out really loud so your parents think you're watching Cheers. Today, human rights, so a constructivist would say, today human rights might be gifts, like, in other words, like, we grant this to you, not because it's your right, but just because we're a nice government, so we're going to give you this particular quote-unquote right. Or they might be rules, like the liberal says, but the important thing is, over time, whatever they are, these can transform into rights. So honestly, if we kind of go back a little bit to here, the constructivist would say back in 1945, the realist was right. Today, the liberal is right, because these things that were suggestions, gifts, whatever, have over time transformed into these things that are actually rights. That's the constructivist story here. So actions lead to habits, which over time lead to norms. That's the whole idea here. So if human rights are, again, we've used this language before, if human rights are, the language of human rights is aspirational, we would love to live in a world where there is no slavery. Constructivism says the more we do that, say that, practice as if the world should be a world without slavery, the more likely it is that the world of the future will be one without slavery. That's the idea here. Okay, so even if you agree with the realists that essentially the human rights aren't really rights, the constructivists would say, but over time and practice, they will become rights. Last one, what would a Marxist say about this? When I say Marxism, you say, that's right, beards and things like that. What are human rights then? Human rights are, not a big surprise, a tool of the capitalists. In the same way the realist says the powerful states use human rights as tools to exert power, the Marxist says capitalists use human rights to protect their capital, to continue to get capital. And human rights are just the latest tools of neocolonialism. It's just another way for wealthy states to get into poorer states and get their hands on their stuff. And it's this sort of idea of you must think and act like us. You must think and act civilized. Civilized means you protect human rights. You don't protect human rights, then here comes R2P to say, I can step in and do whatever I want to with you guys. That's the Marxist says that kind of sucks. The other thing that the Marxist says about human rights that they say is a little bit contradictory is they say the version of human rights we were talking about here, the UDHR, talks about universality, that essentially they're true for everyone everywhere because all humans are equal. And essentially the Marxist says, hold on, they're not. Capitalists are equal and workers are equal to each other, but capitalists and workers in this system are not equal. Workers don't get the same rights as capitalists. They won't get the same rights as capitalists. Capitalists get way better things. And if you want a good example of this, look at how easy it is to move money through the international banking system anywhere you want in the world. And then look at how easy it is for an immigrant to move for anywhere they want in the world. That the rules are not the same. So human rights language is just the language of capitalists to protect their capitalism. Which one of these you like the best? Who knows? But those are all parts of the conversation there. Okay, now you're going to go do that assignment where you're going to look at that particular topic and then do a little bit of a discussion on it. Thanks again, guys, for letting me be a little lazy with those first two lectures. You're the best, even though right now you might not agree with that. I'm assuming in my head you're thinking I'm the best, and I think you're the best. Okay, bye.